Delighted I am to be here. I'm not an economist, I'm not a philosopher, I'm not an expert on the Austrian school, I'm not a disciple of the Austrian school, so one might ask, what am I doing here? Well, first of all, I am a passionate, lifelong liberal. When you then have to say what kind of a liberal, I would say in shorthand a John Stuart Mill liberal, and therefore welcome the conversation with liberals of all kinds. But secondly, because as you mentioned in your introduction, I have been studying Central Europe in particular for more than 40 years, particularly Central Europe under communist rule. And I would like to start with someone who I think should have been mentioned perhaps more today, the Polish philosopher and historian of ideas Leszek Kołakowski, whose main currents of Marxism is, in my view, the book about Marxism. If you only had one, Marxism he describes, you will remember, as the self-deification of mankind, the self-deification of mankind, and concludes that in its Marxist form, it revealed itself as a farcical aspect of human bondage. But Kołakowski wrote an epilogue to the one-volume edition of Main Currents of Marxism in 2005, in which, as well as reflecting on China, which you talked about, and which perhaps we can talk about in discussion, he concluded thus, I quote, "We may safely predict that Marx himself will become more and more what he already is, a chapter from a textbook of the history of ideas, a figure that no longer evokes any emotions, simply the author of one of the great books of the 19th century, one of those books that very few bother to read, but whose titles are known to the educated public. As for my 3 newly combined volumes," Kołakowski goes on, "in which I tried to sum up and assess this philosophy and its later ramifications, they may perhaps be useful to the dwindling number of people still interested in the subject." Well, I'm afraid in those 2 comments, Kołakowski was clearly wrong, because Marx is back and Kołakowski is still there. We've discussed a lot why he is back. I want to emphasize one point which Pedro Schwarz made very eloquently this morning, namely, whatever you think of the content of his thought, he was a brilliant writer. He was a brilliant journalist, and I think a lot of his enduring power has to do with what in German is called Wortmacht, the power of his words, the formulations that even today we could not resist quoting. Now, in turning to Central Europe, I want to look at the question in 2 senses of the spectre still haunting. Firstly, what is the Marxist-Leninist legacy in Central Europe? And secondly, is there anything to be got out of a Marxist analysis of what has happened in Central Europe? On the first point, Kołakowski makes a crucial point. Contrary to much that has been written and said, Kołakowski insists that there is a logical progression from Marxism to Leninism and from Leninism to Stalinism. So Stalinism was not an aberration. It was not, as the comrades used to say, errors and distortions. There is a logical progression from Marxism to Leninism to Stalinism. That is not to say it's an inevitable progression, that Kołakowski does not maintain, but a logical progression, not an aberration. Now, if one then looks at Marxism, Leninism, Stalinism, and asks what was its self-defined central feature, the answer is different from the one which most dissidents and opponents of communism would instinctively have given. They would instinctively have said it was for freedom against communism, for democracy against communism. But in the self-definition, let us remember, the opposite of communism is capitalism. The essence of communism was the elimination of private property. It was the proletariat against the bourgeoisie which in Lenin's view gave us something he called bourgeois democracy. Now, of course, there are many, many aspects of the communist legacy in Central Europe and elsewhere, geopolitical, territorial, educational, military, the attitudes you talked about in society. But I think if one looks at the beginning of the transition in 1989 and asks what was really at the heart of the problem, then much of the answer takes us back to that essence of communism as the opposite of capitalism. There was virtually no capital. There were no property rights, and very little, a little in Poland, private property. Crucially, there was no bourgeoisie. There was no bourgeoisie. Very simple point, but of absolutely fundamental importance. And here, the contrast with post-Franco Spain is, I think, extremely instructive. Because in Spain under Franco, you had capital, you had property rights, you had ownership rights, you had a structure of rule of law to defend them, you had a growing bourgeoisie. The historian of Spain, Raymond Carr, once warden of my college in Oxford, once told me a story which I like to believe is true, although I have a little doubt about it. He told that a colleague of his, who had been close to Franco, had asked Franco right at the end of his life what he, Franco, thought would be the most important part of his legacy. And the answer was completely surprising. He didn't say the unity of Spain or our military strength or the glory. He said, a strong middle class. Now, as I say, I'm not sure if Franco ever actually said it quite like that, but si non vero e bel trovato, because certainly that was Franco's legacy, the strong middle class, precisely. And so, in a sense, the transition to democracy and building democracy, difficult enough as it was in Spain, was a capping out of that social and economic basis. None of that in East Central Europe. Remember, we talked a lot about civil society? It was a mantra of the 1980s, civil society. Well, it did exist, but it existed in a very particular form. It existed in the form of social self-organization, which was the revised title of the Workers' Defense Committee in Poland, a key part of the opposition. KSS Corps, Committee for Social Self-Defense Corps. It was conscious social self-organization and subsequently NGOs with a lot of external funding. This, ladies and gentlemen, is not what Karl Marx meant by civil society. He used the term Bürgergesellschaft, not Zivilgesellschaft, and in the word Bürger, you have both bourgeois and citoyen. It's both the citizen and the bourgeois. And it was building on an economically independent part of society, building on the bourgeoisie. We did not have Bürgergesellschaft. We had civil society in this new form, and we did not have what, again, Pedro Schwartz talked about this morning, the bourgeois spirit that was so important in the early history of democracy. We did not have anything like the rule of law in post-communist Central Europe. We didn't really even have rule by law, as the communists talk about it. Not really even rule by law. Nor did we have the social and cultural foundations of the rule of law, because the rule of law is rooted in a certain social and cultural humus, a soil. And we didn't have independent media. I vividly remember in the spring of 1989, when under the Round Table Agreement, Gazeta Wyborcza, the first legal independent newspaper in Poland, was allowed to be printed in the run-up to the semi-free elections of the 4th of June 1989. It was printed on the printing press of Tribuna Ludu, the Communist Party newspaper. There was still censorship. I once had the privilege actually of taking an article from Gazeta Wyborcza to the censor, a very bored-looking lady drinking a glass of tea. There was no independent. All of that had to be created. The joke at the time was, we know from the history of communism that you can turn an aquarium into fish soup. The question is, can you turn fish soup back into an aquarium? And that summarizes the position perfectly. 30 years on, we now have radical critiques of the post-89 transformation from right and left. There is a book which I found particularly interesting because its thesis is so extreme, by a left-wing Polish journalist called Rafał Wosch, and it's called The Infantile Disorder of Liberalism. Some of you will recognize the allusion to Lenin's left-wing communism as an infantile disorder. And it is a denunciation, almost Karl Marx-style denunciation of liberalism as seen in the transformation from the beginning. The question he totally fails to answer is, what was the alternative? And that remains, in my view, an absolutely fair question to ask, given those extremely difficult starting positions. It was not done. The transformation in Hungary or the Czech Republic or Poland or Slovakia was not done on the basis of economic theory or dogma. It was done on the basis of pragmatism, necessity, trying to create the conditions of a market economy. But it had a cost, and I think some of the problems we are seeing today do have to do with the paths taken at that time. There had to be privatization. There had to be rapid privatization. There's no question about it. But the way in which it was done, and of course it was done in many different ways, but in almost every case, it resulted in what has been called the privatization of the nomenklatura. The nomenklatura being the system of Communist Party appointments to all leading positions in public life. So in the process of taking publicly owned, state-owned enterprises and turning them into private one, the nomenklatura often exploited the possibilities right across the whole of post-communist Europe. This was, to some extent, the price that was paid for a negotiated transition. One has to acknowledge that, but it was a heavy price to pay. Not necessarily because they were bad capitalists. Some of them turned out to be quite good capitalists, actually, but because it produced a sense of profound historical injustice, an anger which is felt to this day, that these bastards, if you'll forgive my French, who had been in the security apparatus, in the secret police, in the censorship apparatus, not only had got off scot-free, because that was the deal in the transition, but were now millionaires and multimillionaires at our expense. And people who had fought communism for decades were often unemployed as a result of the transition, or in much worse off. And, of course, corruption, massive corruption. I was talking yesterday with Karl-Peter Schwarz about what happened in the Czech Republic with Václav Klaus, and as he rightly pointed out, because there wasn't proper banking regulation, because there wasn't proper control of the banking system, there was massive corruption. I participated, in fact, organized an event for Ralph Dahrendorf's 80th birthday, which happened just a few days before he died. And almost the last thing he said in public was, you know, after 1989, we held up the Holy Trinity. We liberals held up the Holy Trinity: free market economy, multi-party democracy, and civil society. And we missed out one element, which was the rule of law. We should have paid much more attention much sooner to the rule of law, so I think it was also our mistake. More complicated is the question of foreign capital, which of course was the other part of the story. I think that foreign capital played a very positive part in modernization, also, by the way, in introducing pluralism and independent media. In many countries, foreign ownership of the media is much criticized. In East Central Europe, I think it was a great advantage. But again, it has produced a backlash, which we see in Poland and Hungary, against a situation which is at least perceived to be one in which East Central Europe has become a supplier of low-wage, skilled labor, mainly for West Central Europe. That's to say, loosely speaking, for German-speaking Central Europe. That is certainly a perception that is out there. Now, again, I think that investment was extremely positive for the region. Joan Robinson, the Cambridge economist who might not be the most popular figure in this room, her politics were somewhat different, but she said one rather amusing thing, which is that there is one thing worse than being exploited, and that's not being exploited. And that truth you can see in the case, for example, of Ukraine. Just to remind you, per capita income in Poland and Ukraine in 1989 was roughly similar. 30 years on, per capita income in Poland is 3 times that in Ukraine. There are some advantages to being exploited, but it has created, I think, an understandable concern about how you take the next step in economic development, how you get out of that position of being the skilled labor, low-wage, manufacturing base for West Central Europe. The answer given, unfortunately, is often the wrong answer. It is nationalization and protectionism. The correct answer would be innovation and becoming more competitive, right? With that answer, there are a number of problems. Let me mention quickly, for reasons of time, just 2. The first is something which I regret very deeply, and I hope I'm not, as it were, insulting anyone in this room who comes from a university in that part of Europe. But one thing that communism, Soviet-type communism, certainly succeeded in doing is very thoroughly destroying what had been great universities in East Central Europe. If you look at a university like the Charles University in Prague, first blow 1938, second blow 1948, third blow 1968, the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, it has not recovered, and nor have the great universities, the traditional universities in Poland, or in Hungary. If you're looking to innovation, it matters a lot if you don't have that supply of innovation. The other thing I want to highlight is whereas in much of the debate about populism in Western Europe, the debate is about immigration and the problems of immigration, East Central Europe's fundamental social problem is not immigration, of which it's had very little, it's emigration, the scale of which is staggering. 1/4 of the population of Lithuania and Latvia in round terms, 1/4 of the population has left since 1989. And of course, they're often the most enterprising, the younger, the most dynamic people. 2 to 3 million from Poland. That's a huge cost. And when I ask young Poles, or indeed Lithuanians or Latvians, why you're not going back, the answer is not about necessarily wage levels or the absence of jobs, or even the politics, although they're not very keen on that. It's very often about the culture of the workplace. This is the thing they may find most difficult to readapt to. Having been in flexible, open, horizontal, dynamic working environments in the West, to come back to these very old-fashioned, I forgot who mentioned I think it was you who mentioned top-down, but top-down is not just the state to society. Top-down is also the hierarchical structure of the workplace. And that, I think, is something that needs a lot of changing. Now, turning for a moment to the question of a Marxist analysis, that is to say, a materialist analysis of what have happened, I want to argue that a materialist analysis of what has happened does not get us very far at all. Actually, I think the purely economic explanation of the end of communism in 1989 doesn't get us very far either. Simply to say East Germany was bankrupt does not get us very far. It was an important fact, but if the Soviet Union had continued to give unconditional support to the regime in East Germany, there would still be an East Germany. It wasn't the decisive factor. But nor do I think that a purely economic explanation helps us to understand what, for want of a better phrase, I'm going to call populism in East Central Europe. So the classic economic explanation as applies to the United States or the UK is stagnant or declining real wages, dramatically increasing income and wealth inequality, and the impact of the financial crisis. If you take a country like Poland, none of this applies. I mentioned already the growth in per capita income. growth rates have been spectacular. 3, 4, 5, 6%. EBRD is predicting 4.1% next year. Since Poland joined the EU, real wages have increased by 50%. 50% in Poland. And the Gini coefficient, the famous Gini coefficient, way down. And it's actually gone down since 2004. It's way down. Take East Germany for a moment, the support for the Alternative für Deutschland. Well, first of all, I don't need to tell you the German economy hasn't exactly been struggling in recent years. But what is more interesting, in the polling of AfD voters, 4 out of 5 AfD voters assess their own personal economic situation as good or very good. 4/5. So economics doesn't do it. It doesn't do it in this part of the world. Fundamentally, the explanation, in my view, is cultural. It's a cultural reaction. Beside the issue of income inequality, there's what I call the issue of inequality of attention or inequality of respect. That's to say, a large part of these societies feel themselves to have been ignored and disrespected by corrupt, remote metropolitan elites and the media. The Law and Justice Party in Poland talks about the redistribution of prestige, the redistribution of respect. It's a very telling, slightly odd, but very telling term. And then, of course, there is the trauma of transition, of transformation, which should not be underestimated. Necessary as it was, it has meant the transformation of a whole, to use a German phrase, Lebenswelt, a whole lived way of life. You have the trauma of transformation, globalization, liberalization, Europeanization, digitization, all coming one after the other in a kind of revolutionary dynamic. And just as Karl Marx described the bourgeoisie as a revolutionary force, this has been a kind of revolutionary experience. And a lot of what I see is a reaction against that, and you reach back, by the way, from a highly atomized consumer society. Because what one has to understand is that whereas in our own countries, in the West, a consumer society goes along with a whole set of ligatures of organically and historically grown civil society, the small platoons of which Edmund Burke spoke. That had been destroyed by communism, and much of it has not been recreated. So you are indeed left with a rather extreme version of that, to use Tönnies' famous phrase, Gesellschaft against Gemeinschaft. And so you go back, it's pulled back to Gemeinschaft. I am, as I said, no expert on the Austrian school, but I understand there is something in the Austrian school called the subjective theory of value. And I think the subjective theory of value against crude use or labor theories of value can get quite a long way in this analysis if one uses it in a broader sense of how people value, what value they place on a particular good. Liberals, and this is something which Isaiah Berlin often stressed, have often not paid enough attention to the need for belonging. It's a great theme of Berlin's, belonging, community, identity, sovereignty, dignity, memory, tradition, history. These things which are now coming back, and coming back quite understandably. And when I mention memory, tradition, and history, that takes me to another crucial element, which is what one might call the politics of memory. In Polish, one says polityka historyczna, historical politics or policy, it means both. Now, one of these battles of memory over memory is an interpretation of what happened in 1989, which suggests that basically it was just a series of corrupt backroom deals between communists and ex-communists, between the red and the pink. On one side of the round table in Poland, you have the communists. On the other, you have ex-communists, now members of the so-called liberal opposition. I have to say, as someone who witnessed this at first hand and talked to all the key players, this view is totally unhistorical. It is as unhistorical as the critique of the economic transformation, because it ignores the conditions at the time. There was still the Red Army in Poland. There was still a GDR. There was still the Red Army in the GDR. Nobody knew what the Soviet Union was going to be ready to accept. To demand, as it were, a total, with one leap, Eastern Europe is free, is totally unhistorical. But what I do think is true is that those who led the transition to democracy made a crucial mistake in not having a much more systematic public confrontation with the communist past. I'm not a great fan of the German word Vergangenheitsbewältigung, because bewältigen is a complex term, but Geschichtsaufarbeitung is a more numeral term. There was much too little Geschichtsaufarbeitung and much too little, particularly in the sense of a public, almost ritual confrontation of the new democracy with a difficult past. I was interested that you mentioned the TRC in Peru, right? Truth and Reconciliation Commission. My view is that if you make a velvet revolution, that's to say a negotiated transition, then you better have a truth commission. By the way, Professor Gersi, I would just say a truth commission. I'm a skeptic about the idea of putting reconciliation into the same thing, because reconciliation has a difficult timetable, it requires forgiveness, and you cannot compel the victims or their relatives to forgive. It's up to them, and it has, but a truth commission. And that, I think, is a major failure of the leadership of the transitions. It meant that there was no sense of catharsis. It also meant that there was no sense of a clear, bright line separating bad communist past from better democratic present and future. And to have such a sense of the division between past and present is very important for a healthy democracy. There are, I like to say, three, as it were, states of collective consciousness. There is, so to speak, a Scylla and a Charybdis. The Scylla is amnesia. The Charybdis is what I call hypermnesia. And in hypermnesia, the frontier between past and present has simply ceased to exist. They coexist in synchronic fashion. Let me give you an example. When Kosovo was still under Serbian control, I had occasion to talk to the Serbian, effectively, governor of Kosovo. As you know, at that time, ethnic Albanians were well over 90% of the population of Kosovo. I thought I'd better get this straight at the beginning of our conversation. So I said, could you just tell me what is the ethnic composition of Kosovo? And he said, well, indeed, yes. In the 12th century, the Serbs were 90% of the population, according to the UN census of 1198, no doubt. And it was a wonderful example of this condition of hypermnesia. There's a good joke about it in Northern Ireland, which is the plane is coming in to land at Belfast, and the pilot says, ladies and gentlemen, we're coming in to land at Belfast. The weather in Belfast is fine. Landing conditions are good. And the time in Belfast is 1683. That's hypermnesia. And what one needs is what I call mesomnesia, somewhere a condition between amnesia and hypermnesia. Mesomnesia, where we have a knowledge of the past, we know what happened, we know what the Shining Path did, we know what the Stasi did, we know what the Communist Party did, but it's not haunting us every day. It's not part of our lived everyday reality. And in that sense, I think a spectre is still haunting Central Europe, but it's very different from Karl Marx in 1848, because in Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto in 1848, the spectre was the ghost of communism to come. In 2018, it's a ghost of communism past, which is still haunting. And by the way, it's normally past ghosts that haunt us more than future ones. Two last comments, and then I'd sit down and throw it open. Firstly, in the politics of fighting communism, the battle for the truth was of absolutely cardinal importance. This is why Orwell and Solzhenitsyn are such crucial figures in the history of the battle against communism, because communist regimes were what I call logocracies. They lived by the semantic occupation of the public sphere, or if you will, the big lie. And when that semantic occupation of the public sphere, when the big lie was broken, they quickly came tumbling down, as Solzhenitsyn foretold in his great Nobel Prize lecture. I always think it's no accident that Václav Havel spoke from the balcony of a newspaper called Svobodne Slovo, the free world. Now we have, with the problem of social media and the internet, a new kind of challenge, the post-truth or post-fact challenge, where the challenge is different. It's not the single totalitarian monopoly occupation of the whole public sphere. It lies in echo chambers or filter bubble on the internet, relatively small groups of people. But the mechanism is the same. Through constant repetition of the lie, it becomes effective. The final point I want, or perhaps penultimate point I want to make, is that if one goes to the absolute bottom line and asks what was wrong fundamentally with what was the original sin and flaw of communism, it was that its anthropology was wrong. Its picture of the human being was fundamentally flawed. It would have worked fine if people had only been angels. But unfortunately, because they aren't, it set out to build a heaven on earth and ended building a hell on earth. Whereas what we liberals try to do, as Kant said in Zum ewigen Frieden, is to build a system which would work even with a race of devils. The same is, of course, said in the Federalist Papers. So in all the challenges we face, I think we liberals have to keep interrogating ourselves and making sure that our anthropology, our basic picture of people who are not interested just in material self-interest is correct, that other human needs, belonging, community, memory, identity, are taken account of in a free society. I am confident that the future belongs to liberalism, even if the skies look fairly dark today. But it will belong to us if we continue to have the crucial combination for liberals, which is on the one hand to be self-critical, because self-criticism belongs to the essence, the very intellectual essence of liberalism, but at the same time to be fighters, to fight for what we believe in, because liberalism, at best in its true form, is always a fighting creed. Now, to be self-critical fighters is not always easy. Some of the best soldiers in history probably haven't been terribly self-critical, one might guess. But that's what we liberals have to be. And ladies and gentlemen, if we continue to be self-critical fighters, then the victory will be ours. Thank you very much.